Watch it, old man, the teenager snarled, deliberately shoving 90-year-old Frank Sullivan with enough force to send him stumbling off the curb. Shadow. Frank's one-eyed German shepherd with a prosthetic front leg, lunged to steady his master, but was kicked sideways into the busy street alongside him. Horns blared as tires screeched against asphalt. Frank, a decorated veteran of 3 wars, caught his balance just in time, his weathered hand clutching Shadow's harness. His heart pounded not from fear, but from a sudden cold rage that he hadn't felt since Quai Cinq. 1968. Look at the gimp dog dance. One of the teens laughed, high-fiving his friends as they sauntered away, the Department of Defense letter that had fallen from Frank's pocket now fluttering in the tallest boy's hand like a trophy. 20 minutes later, as they were still congratulating themselves in a nearby alley, the narrow entrance was suddenly blocked by 2 imposing figures in Marine Corps dress blues, followed by the distinct, disciplined sound of marching boots. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Sullivan had lived 90 years, and most of them had been dedicated to service. He'd enlisted as a boy, lying about his age to join the Navy and fight in World War II, then stayed in to serve through Korea and Vietnam before retiring as a senior chief petty officer. After leaving the service, he'd found purpose again as a history teacher at Ocean View High School, where for 30 years he'd shaped young minds before age forced a second retirement. His small apartment overlooking the Massachusetts coastline was filled with carefully preserved mementos, faded photographs of young men in uniform, service commendations, and a shadow box displaying his medals he never wore but cherished as reminders of the men he'd fought alongside, the sacrifices made. His most treasured possession was a framed photo of Clara, his wife of 60 years, who had passed 3 summers ago, every morning. He talked to that photograph as he drank his coffee. His body was frail now, his steps slow and aided by a simple wooden cane, but his eyes still held the clear, direct gaze of a man who had faced death and never blinked. Shadow, his German shepherd, was similarly marked by age and hardship. The dog had lost an eye and part of his left front leg to an IED. While serving with a Marine unit in a conflict Frank had been too old to join. The military K-9 had saved 14 lives that day before dragging himself back to his handler with shrapnel embedded in his body. Frank had adopted Shadow 6 years ago from a veterans service dog program. Both broken, both survivors. They recognized something in each other, that first day a stubborn dignity, a refusal to surrender to infirmity or age. They lived quietly together, their days punctuated by walks to the local park, visits to Clara's grave, and weekly stops at Henley's Bakery for glazed donuts, one for Frank, one for Shadow. The Department of Defense letter that had arrived yesterday was the first communication about his old SEAL team in decades. It contained information about Powell, Martinez, and Jeffries' men listed as MIA since 1968, men Frank had searched for until forced to evacuate. Their families deserved answers, and today Frank would deliver them at the monthly veterans meeting, if he could make it there. Frank set out for his walk at precisely 9:15 a.m., as he did every Thursday. Shadow padded faithfully beside him, the dog's specialized harness allowing Frank to maintain his balance on days when his arthritis flared. The morning held the crisp promise of early autumn leaves just beginning to turn along Ocean View's tree-lined streets. The distant scent of salt water carried on a gentle breeze. "We'll get your donut first," then visit Mom, then make it to the meeting by noon," Frank said to Shadow, who looked up with his one good eye, tail wagging in understanding. Frank patted the inside pocket of his Navy peacoat, feeling the reassuring crinkle of the Department of Defense letter. After 53 years, the families of his men would finally have answers. The route to Henley's bakery took them past the town's small fishing harbor, where Frank paused briefly to watch the boats. He'd spent his childhood summers working those same docks before the war called him away. Shadow waited patiently, understanding his master's ritual moments of reflection. They continued their journey. Turning onto Maple Street with its row of small businesses, Frank could see Henley's storefront ahead, the warm glow of lights inviting against the gray morning. But between them and their destination, sprawled across the narrow sidewalk outside the bakery, was a familiar sight that made Frank's jaw tighten. The group of teenagers, 4 boys and a girl, were regulars in the neighborhood, often found loitering, their boredom manifesting as petty vandalism or casual intimidation of passers-by. Frank usually gave them a wide berth, not out of fear but to avoid unnecessary confrontation. Today, however, they completely blocked the narrow sidewalk, sprawled across a bench, their legs stretched out, forcing other pedestrians into the gutter. Frank approached, intending to politely ask them to make way. "Excuse me, young folks," he began, his voice a little raspy with age. "Could I trouble you to let an old sailor and his dog pass?" The apparent leader of the group, a tall youth with a sneering expression and expensive sneakers, looked Frank up and down with contempt. "Old sailor, huh?" He mimicked Frank's slight stoop. "What are you, 100?" His companions snickered. "Just trying to get to the bakery," Frank said, ignoring the jibe, his hand resting on Shadow's harness while the dog stood alert, sensing the tension. "Mind? Yeah. I think we do mind," the leader echoed mockingly. "This is our bench, Grandpa. Find another route." He deliberately stretched his legs further, completely blocking the path. Another teen chimed in. "Yeah, maybe you should just go home and take a nap before you fall and can't get up." The girl in the group laughed loudest at this, filming with her phone. Frank felt a familiar stirring of disciplined anger, the kind he hadn't felt in years, but he kept his voice level. "There's no need for rudeness, just asking for a little courtesy." "Courtesy," the leader scoffed. He stood up, towering over Frank, clearly intending to intimidate. "You want courtesy. Maybe you should show some respect to your betters." He then did something utterly unexpected and wantonly cruel. As Frank tried to step around him, the teen deliberately stuck out his foot, tripping the old man, while simultaneously giving him a hard shove on the shoulder. "Watch it, old man," he snarled as Frank, his balance lost, stumbled precariously off the high curb. The letter dislodged from his pocket, fluttering to the ground where the girl quickly snatched it up. Shadow, loyal to the end, lunged to steady his master. But another boy kicked the dog's prosthetic leg, sending both of them tumbling into the path of oncoming traffic. Horns blared furiously. A delivery truck swerved violently to avoid them. Frank, his heart hammering, scrambled back toward the curb, his old reflexes surprisingly sharp as he pulled Shadow with him. The dog whimpered, his prosthetic leg bent at an unnatural angle. The teenagers roared with laughter, pointing, finding the near tragedy hilarious. "Look at him dance," one shouted. "Maybe he learned that in the Navy." They high-fived each other, the girl waving Frank's letter tauntingly. "Hey, look at this official government stuff. Department of Defense classified." She began to read mockingly. Regarding the status of missing personnel, seeing a few angry glares from other pedestrians who had witnessed the event, they sauntered off down a nearby alleyway, still chuckling, taking Frank's precious letter with them. A kind woman with graying hair rushed forward to help Frank retrieve his cane and ensure he was all right. "Those dreadful kids," she exclaimed. "I'm Emily Parker from the library." "Are you hurt?" Frank, though his hip ached from the stumble and his dignity was severely bruised, managed a shaky smile. "Just startled, ma'am. Thank you for your kindness." But his eyes followed the teenagers disappearing with his letter, and the casual cruelty, the utter lack of respect, cut deeper than any physical ache. Frank brushed himself off, his hands trembling slightly as he assessed Shadow's condition. The dog's prosthetic leg had been damaged in the fall, the custom joint bent at an awkward angle. Shadow stood on 3 legs, whimpering softly but still alert, his good eye fixed on the alley where the teenagers had disappeared. "They took something important from you, didn't they?" Emily asked, noticing Frank's distress as he patted his empty pocket. "A letter from the Department of Defense," Frank replied, his voice tight. "Information about men who went missing in Vietnam. Their families have waited over 50 years for answers." He stroked Shadow's head, his jaw clenched in determination. "I can't let those kids destroy it or throw it away." Emily frowned. "Should we call the police?" Frank considered this but shook his head. "By the time they respond and take statements, those kids could be long gone with the letter." He straightened his back. "Decision made." "No, ma'am. This requires a different approach." The memory surfaced unbidden. Quang Tri Province, 1968. His SEAL team pinned down by enemy fire, their extraction helicopter unable to land. Lieutenant Martinez had looked at him and said, "Sometimes you have to handle things outside normal channels." Sullivan. They'd created a diversion that night, saved 16 men. Martinez disappeared 3 weeks later on another mission. Frank knew the neighborhood. He knew the alley those teenagers had disappeared into led to a dead end, a small enclosed courtyard behind an abandoned cannery, a favorite hangout for local troublemakers. He also remembered something else. The local Marine Corps recruiting station was only 2 blocks away, and the gunnery sergeant in charge, a young hard-as-nails Marine named Mason Rodriguez, had been one of his students 15 years ago at Ocean View High. Mason had been a troubled teen himself, once bright but directionless. Raised by a single father who had served in Vietnam and struggled with PTSD. Frank had recognized the boy's potential, channeled his energy into debate club and history projects about military strategy. After graduation, Mason had enlisted, found purpose in the Corps, and returned years later to recruit the next generation. "There's a Marine recruiting office 2 blocks from here," Frank told Emily. "Would you be kind enough to help me and Shadow get there?" Emily nodded, offering her arm for support. Together, they made their way slowly to the recruiting office, Shadow limping beside them. The modest storefront bore the Marine Corps emblem and the slogan, "The few, the proud." Through the window, Frank could see 2 Marines in service uniforms working at desks. The bell chimed as they entered. A young corporal looked up, immediately noticing Frank's military bearing despite his age. "Good morning, sir. How can we help you today?" "I need to speak with Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez," Frank said, his voice stronger now. "Tell him Master Chief Sullivan is here. It's urgent." The corporal's eyes widened slightly at Frank's rank, and he disappeared into a back office. Moments later, Mason Rodriguez emerged, his face breaking into a smile of recognition that quickly turned to concern when he saw Frank's disheveled appearance and Shadow's injured prosthetic. "Master Chief," Mason said, snapping to attention out of respect before stepping forward to shake Frank's hand. "Sir, what happened to you and Shadow?" Frank explained the situation concisely: the teenagers, the shove into traffic, the stolen Department of Defense letter, the location of the alley. He didn't embellish, didn't ask for retribution, just stated the facts with the precision of a military report. "The letter contains closure for families who've waited half a century," Frank finished quietly. "And those kids think it's a joke." Mason's expression had grown increasingly grim as Frank spoke. When Frank mentioned the alley behind the old cannery, Mason exchanged knowing glances with the corporal. "We know that spot," Mason said. "Those might be the same kids who've been defacing the war memorial in the park. The tall one, would he be wearing expensive sneakers, designer clothes?" Frank nodded. "That's likely Tyler Williams, the mayor's nephew," Mason said, his jaw tight. "Been causing trouble all summer, but his uncle keeps things quiet." Mason turned to the corporal. "Peterson, call Staff Sergeant Winters and Sergeant Davidson at the Community Outreach Office. Tell them to meet us in civilian clothes at the corner of Elm and 3rd in 10 minutes. Tell Davidson to bring the camera. We'll need documentation." The corporal moved immediately to the phone while Mason helped Frank to a chair. "You should rest, Master Chief. We'll handle this." Frank shook his head. "I'll come with you. Not to confront them, I know my limitations, but I need that letter back intact." Mason seemed about to argue, but recognized the determination in the old sailor's eyes. "Understood, sir. We'll take my car." As they waited for the other Marines, Mason knelt to examine Shadow's prosthetic. "This needs professional attention. My cousin's a vet tech at Dr. Campbell's clinic. We'll take Shadow there after we recover your letter." Frank placed a weathered hand on Mason's shoulder. "Thank you, son. This letter, it's not just paper. It's the final chapter for men I served with, men I searched for until they forced us to evacuate. Their families deserve to know what happened, even after all these years." Mason nodded solemnly. "My father served in Vietnam, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines at Khe Sanh." Something flickered in Frank's eyes. "What's your father's name?" "Miguel Rodriguez. Everyone called him Mickey." Frank's hand tightened on Mason's shoulder. "Corman Sullivan," he said quietly. "That's what they called me during a temporary assignment with the Marines in '68. I pulled a young Marine named Mickey Rodriguez out of a fire zone at Khe Sanh." Mason stared at Frank, shock and recognition dawning on his face. All these years, he'd known Frank as his history teacher, mentor, the man who'd guided him toward the Marines. Never once had Frank mentioned saving his father's life. "Sir," Mason began, his voice thick with emotion. Frank shook his head. "Later, son. Right now, we have a mission. Those boys have something that doesn't belong to them, and families who've waited 50 years for answers can't wait another day." The phone rang, and the corporal announced that the other Marines were en route. Mason stood, his posture reflecting renewed purpose. "We'll get your letter back. Master Chief, That's a promise. Frank sat on a bench across from the alley entrance, Shadow resting at his feet. Mason had insisted the old veteran stay at a safe distance while the Marines handled the situation. Emily Parker had reluctantly left for her shift at the library, but not before giving Frank her phone number and extracting a promise that he would call later to let her know how things turned out. The autumn sun warmed his face as he waited, memories washing over him like waves on the Ocean View shore. Teaching had been Frank's second calling after the Navy. He'd never expected to find such fulfillment in a classroom. But guiding young minds through history, especially the difficult, nuanced history of America's wars, had given him purpose during peacetime. He'd made it his mission to teach not just dates and battles, but the human cost of conflict, the valor of ordinary men and women thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Mason Rodriguez had been one of those students who made teaching worthwhile. Brilliant but angry, the boy had been heading down a dangerous path when he landed in Frank's USE history class in his junior year. Frank recognized the pain behind the defiance, the same pain he'd seen in young sailors and soldiers who'd lost friends in combat. "Your father served, didn't he?" Frank had asked Mason after class one day. "Vietnam," Mason had answered curtly. "Doesn't talk about it. Doesn't talk much at all." Frank had nodded, understanding. Sometimes the men who've seen the worst find it hardest to speak of it. He'd handed Mason a book, not a standard text, but a collection of letters from servicemen to their families. History isn't just in textbooks. It's in the voices of those who lived it. That had been the turning point. Mason devoured the book, then asked for more. He joined the debate team when Frank suggested it, discovered his talent for leadership, graduated with honors, and found his path in the Marines, not running from his father's silence, but honoring it. And now, by some twist of fate, Frank learned he had saved Mason's father at Khe Sanh. The connection left him momentarily breathless. How many invisible threads linked people across time? How many actions had consequences that rippled through decades? Shadow stirred, lifting his head to look across the street. Frank followed the dog's gaze to see Staff Sergeant Winters and Sergeant Davidson approaching the bench. Both wore civilian clothes, jeans and polo shirts, but their military bearing was unmistakable. "Master Chief Sullivan," Davidson said respectfully. At 45, he was the oldest of the Marines, a Vietnam veteran himself who joined the Corps in the final years of that conflict. "Gunny Rodriguez thought you might appreciate an update." Frank nodded, grateful. "What's happening?" "We've confirmed 5 teenagers in the alley courtyard," Winters reported. "They're still there, passing around what appears to be your letter, sir. They've also got alcohol and what might be marijuana, judging from the smell." Frank frowned. "Any indication they've damaged the letter?" "It appears intact from our observation point," Davidson assured him. "Gunny Rodriguez is gathering the team now. We're approaching from both entrances to the courtyard. There's a service door from the old cannery that's been broken open for years." Shadow whined softly, and Frank placed a calming hand on the dog's head. The German Shepherd had served as a detection dog before losing his leg, trained to find explosives, weapons, and drugs. Even in retirement, those instincts remained sharp. "The dog's trying to tell you something," Davidson observed. "These old K9s, they never really forget their training." Frank looked at Shadow with new understanding. You're smelling more than marijuana, aren't you, boy? He turned to the Marines. Shadow was a detection dog, top of his class. If he's this alert from across the street. Davidson and Winters exchanged glances. Might be worth mentioning to Gunny, Winters said. If there's harder stuff in play, that changes things. As Davidson stepped away to make a call, Frank's mind returned to the letter. The Department of Defense had been surprisingly forthcoming after all these years. The report detailed a covert operation gone wrong, a helicopter crash in territory controlled by North Vietnamese forces, and evidence that 3 Americans had survived initially but died during captivity. Dental records had confirmed their identities 50 years later when a joint U.S. Vietnamese team excavated a forgotten prison camp. The hardest part of the report was learning that Powell, Martinez, and Jeffries had lived for nearly 2 years after being listed as MIA. Frank had searched for them for weeks before being ordered to stand down. How different might things have been if he'd found them? The question had haunted his sleep since receiving the letter. Gunny says to sit tight, sir, Davidson reported, returning to the bench. They're moving into position now. Inside the alleyway courtyard, Tyler Williams leaned against a graffiti-covered wall, turning the official government letter over in his hands, while his friends passed around a bottle in a paper bag and a hand-rolled cigarette. Check out this official document crap, Tyler said, affecting an exaggerated formal tone. The Department of Defense regrets to inform interested parties that evidence conclusively identifies remains recovered from Site 117B as those of Lieutenant Michael Martinez, Petty Officer James Powell, and Petty Officer Robert Jeffries, previously listed as missing in action. He snickered. Missing in action, more like missing the action. Probably hiding out of the whole time. Jason Cooper, the tallest of the group and the one with a small tattoo partially visible beneath his sleeve, took the letter and scanned it with more interest. This is actually pretty serious stuff. Man, look at these coordinates. This is intel about a POW camp. So what? Tyler shrugged. Ancient history. Who cares about some guys who got themselves captured 50 years ago? Jason's eyes narrowed. People pay for this kind of information. Military collectors, memorabilia dealers. My cousin works for a guy who'd give us good money for genuine Vietnam War documents, especially ones with specific names and locations. You want to sell the old man's letter? The girl, Amber, asked, looking uncomfortable for the first time. That seems wrong. Did you see his face when he fell? And that poor dog? What's wrong is him getting in our way, Tyler snapped. Nobody told him to try walking past us. He could have crossed the street. With a 3-legged dog and a cane, Amber challenged. Besides, we shouldn't have been blocking the sidewalk in the first place. When did you get so sensitive? Tyler mocked. You were laughing with the rest of us when he fell. Amber looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. That was before I saw how bad the dog was hurt, and before I knew what the letter was about. Jason ignored their argument, still studying the document. This is the real deal. Names, dates, coordinates. There's even a next of kin list. His finger traced over a name. Sullivan, F., SEAL Team 2, Search Party Commander. He looked up. Wait. That's the old guy. He was a Navy SEAL. Tyler snatched the letter back. No way that ancient fossil was a SEAL. Those are the badass guys who got bin Laden. SEALs have been around since the 60s. Dumbass, Jason retorted. My dad was in the Navy. He said the Vietnam-era SEALs were some of the toughest ever. Whatever. Tyler dismissed, folding the letter carelessly and stuffing it in his pocket. I'm not scared of some 90-year-old has-been. A new voice cut through the courtyard, calm but commanding. You should be more concerned about the Marines who respect that 90-year-old has-been. The teenagers spun around to find Mason Rodriguez standing at one entrance to the courtyard, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. He wore civilian clothes, but the military precision of his stance betrayed his identity. At the same moment, 3 more Marines appeared at the opposite entrance, effectively cutting off any escape route. They moved with silent efficiency, fanning out to cover the space. None were in uniform, yet the teenagers immediately recognized the threat they posed. Private property, Tyler blustered, trying to sound tough despite the sudden dryness in his mouth. You're trespassing. Actually, Mason replied evenly. This is city property, currently condemned and marked for demolition next month. You're the trespassers, but that's the least of your concerns right now. Mason stepped further into the courtyard, his gaze sweeping over the group before settling on Tyler. You have something that doesn't belong to you. A letter addressed to Master Chief Frank Sullivan, delivered by the Department of Defense. Tyler's hand moved instinctively to his pocket. Don't know what you're talking about. Your friend there seems to know exactly what I'm talking about, Mason observed, nodding toward Jason, whose face had gone pale. He recognizes the significance of that document. He understands that taking it wasn't just petty theft. It was interference with official government communication about fallen servicemen. Sergeant Davidson moved closer, his voice pitched to Carrie. And if I'm not mistaken, he was just suggesting you sell that information for profit. That's a federal offense when it concerns classified military locations. Jason took an involuntary step back. We weren't really... The hell with this, Tyler interrupted. Who are you people anyway? You can't detain us. You're not cops. No, Mason agreed. We're Marines. And that letter you stole contains information about men who died serving their country, men whose families have waited 50 years to know their fate. One of those search party commanders is sitting across the street right now, watching us. He was pushed into traffic by you and your friends, and his service dog was injured in the process. A flicker of unease crossed Tyler's face. It was just a joke. Nobody got hurt. That joke could have killed him, Mason said, his voice dangerously quiet. And that nobody is a man who has given more to this country than you can comprehend. Master Chief Sullivan served in 3 wars, earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star, and spent decades teaching history to ungrateful kids like you at Ocean View High. Tyler's swagger faltered as the Marines closed in, not threateningly, but with implacable purpose. We're not here to harm you, Mason continued. We're here to educate you. First lesson, there are consequences for your actions. Second lesson, respect isn't optional when it comes to veterans who sacrificed for your freedom. Outside the alley, Frank watched with Shadow at his side as Mason implemented what the Marines called a presence patrol, a show of force without actual violence. It was a tactic Frank had seen used effectively in villages overseas, letting the implicit threat do the work while maintaining discipline. Shadow suddenly stiffened, his nose working the air currents from the alley. The dog's training had focused on explosive detection, but like most military canines, he'd been cross-trained to alert on drugs as well. His change in posture was subtle but unmistakable to Frank. "What is it, boy?" Frank murmured, his hand gentle on the dog's head. Shadow's good eye remained fixed on the alley, his body tense with alertness. Frank had seen that look before, in the jungles of Vietnam, when Shadow's predecessors had detected enemy fighters or booby traps. This wasn't about the marijuana Winters had mentioned. This was something more serious. Frank slowly rose from the bench, supporting himself on his cane, and made his way across the street. Age might have diminished his strength, but it hadn't dulled his instincts or his sense of duty. If Shadow was alerting on something dangerous, Mason needed to know. As Frank approached the alley entrance, he could hear Mason's voice, controlled but forceful, delivering what Frank recognized as a classic Marine Corps attitude adjustment, not physical, but a verbal dismantling designed to strip away bravado and force self-reflection. "That man you pushed," Mason was saying, "he pulled my father out of enemy fire at Khe Sanh. If he hadn't risked his life that day, I wouldn't be standing here. My father wouldn't have come home. I wouldn't have been born." The teenagers stood in stunned silence at this revelation. Frank paused at the alley entrance, not wanting to interrupt the moment. Shadow, however, had other ideas. The German shepherd moved forward, limping on his damaged prosthetic but determined, heading straight for Jason Cooper's backpack which lay against the wall. "Shadow!" Frank called, but the dog ignored him, focused on his training. He reached the backpack and sat down beside it, looking expectantly at Frank, the passive, alert posture of a detection dog who had found what he was trained to find. Mason turned, surprised to see Frank and Shadow in the alley. "Master Chief, we were just about to—" Frank held up a hand, cutting him off. "Shadow's alerting on that backpack," he said quietly. "He was cross-trained for narcotics detection after his explosives work. Something in there is triggering him." The atmosphere in the courtyard shifted instantly. The Marine's focus snapped to Jason Cooper, who had gone deathly pale. "It's just my school stuff," Jason stammered. "Then you won't mind if we take a look?" Mason replied, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. He nodded to one of his Marines, who stepped forward and carefully opened the backpack. Inside, beneath textbooks and notebooks, was a plastic bag containing white powder and several smaller baggies of pills. Sergeant Davidson, who had worked with the local police department's drug task force, recognized the contents immediately. "That's not marijuana," he said grimly. "That's fentanyl, mixed with cocaine. And those look like prescription opioids." Tyler Williams backed away from Jason, hands raised. "I didn't know about that. That's all him. I just hang out with him sometimes." Amber and the other teens likewise distanced themselves, shock evident on their faces. This had escalated far beyond shoving an old man or stealing a letter. Mason looked at Jason's partially visible tattoo with new understanding. "That's a Northside Devils marking, isn't it? You're running product for them in Ocean View?" Jason said nothing, his eyes darting between the Marines and the alley entrances, calculating his chances of escape. Frank moved further into the courtyard, Shadow limping beside him. Despite his age, There was nothing frail about Frank Sullivan at that moment. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "Son, right now you're in trouble, but you haven't destroyed your life yet. Next step you take determines whether this is a turning point or the beginning of the end." The courtyard fell silent as Frank's words hung in the air. Jason Cooper stood frozen, his eyes darting between the backpack with its damning contents and the stern faces of the Marines surrounding him. The other teenagers had backed against the wall, their earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of this unexpected development. "Police are already on their way," Mason said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Sergeant Davidson called them as soon as we identified the drugs. This isn't something we can handle internally anymore." Jason's face crumpled, the tough facade finally breaking. "They'll kill me," he whispered, just loud enough for Frank to hear. "The devils don't let people walk away." Frank studied the boy's face, seeing past the defiance to the fear beneath. How many young men had he seen with that same expression, boys thrust into situations beyond their control, facing enemies they weren't prepared to fight? In Vietnam, in Korea, even as far back as those final Pacific islands in World War II. "What's your full name, son?" Frank asked, his voice steady and calm amid the tension. "Jason Cooper," the boy replied automatically, military presence commanding his respect despite himself. "Cooper," Frank repeated thoughtfully. "Any relation to Michael Cooper, Riverine Force, Mekong Delta?" Jason's head snapped up, surprise momentarily overriding his fear. "My grandfather. How did you—" "I crossed paths with him in '68. Good man. Saved our extraction team when our boat engine failed." Frank took a step closer, leaning on his cane. "He wouldn't want this for you, son." Something shifted in Jason's expression, a flicker of shame, perhaps, or recognition. Before he could respond, the distant wail of police sirens cut through the air. The sound galvanized him into action. With a sudden, desperate movement, he lunged toward the service entrance where fewer Marines stood guard. He might have made it past a normal group of men, but these were Marines. Staff Sergeant Winters moved with practiced efficiency, catching Jason's arm and using the boy's own momentum to bring him safely but firmly to the ground in a controlled takedown. "Easy now," Winters said, maintaining his hold without causing pain. "Don't make this worse than it already is." While Winters secured Jason, Mason approached Tyler, hand outstretched. "The letter," he said simply. It wasn't a request. Tyler hesitated only briefly before reaching into his pocket and extracting the folded Department of Defense document. He handed it over without meeting Mason's eyes. All pretense of toughness abandoned. Mason carefully smoothed the creases in the letter before walking it over to Frank. "Master Chief," he said formally, presenting the document with both hands, "I believe this belongs to you." Frank accepted the letter with a nod of gratitude, quickly scanning its contents to ensure nothing had been damaged or removed. The names of his lost teammates Martinez, Powell, Jeffries stared back at him from the official letterhead, along with the coordinates where their remains had finally been recovered. 50 years of uncertainty, compressed into 3 pages of government prose. As Frank tucked the letter safely back into his inside pocket, 2 Ocean View police cruisers pulled up at the alley entrance, lights flashing. 4 officers approached cautiously, hands near their weapons until they recognized Mason. "Gunny Rodriguez?" The lead officer greeted him, Dispatch said you called in possible narcotics. Confirmed narcotics. Officer Benson. Mason replied, gesturing toward the open backpack. Fentanyl, cocaine, and what appear to be prescription opioids found in possession of this individual while we were recovering stolen government property. Officer Benson raised an eyebrow. Stolen government property. Department of Defense communication, Mason explained, nodding toward Frank. Stolen from Master Chief Sullivan here after this group assaulted him and his service dog on Maple Street. The officer's demeanor changed subtly as they looked at Frank and Shadow, respect replacing professional detachment. Officer Benson had served 4 years in the Army before joining the Ocean View PD. He recognized the significance of Frank's bearing and Shadow's prosthetic leg. "We'll need statements from everyone," Benson said, then added more gently, "though we can take yours at home if that's more comfortable." "Master Chief." Frank shook his head. "I'll give my statement now. Officer, the sooner this is resolved, the sooner I can get Shadow's prosthetic repaired and deliver this information to my teammates' families." As the officers began processing the scene, separating the teenagers for individual questioning, Frank noticed Amber standing slightly apart, tears streaming silently down her face. Unlike the others, she wasn't trying to distance herself from responsibility or minimize her involvement. Frank made his way over to her, Shadow limping faithfully beside him. "Young lady," he said quietly, "are you all right?" Amber looked up, surprised that he would ask about her welfare after what they'd done. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't. I laughed when you fell. I didn't stop them. I didn't help you." Frank nodded, acknowledging her words without immediately absolving her. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I was wrong," she said simply. "My grandfather was in Vietnam, too. He never talks about it. When I saw the letter, saw that it was about missing soldiers." She shook her head, unable to continue. "What's your grandfather's name?" Frank asked. "James Mitchell. He was a combat photographer." 173rd Airborne. Frank's eyes widened slightly. "Mitchell. Tall man. Southern accent." Amber nodded, surprised. "You knew him?" "I met him briefly in Saigon, 1967. His photos helped us plan several operations." Frank studied her face, seeing hints of her grandfather in her features. "Does he know you spend your time with these boys, intimidating old men and vandalizing memorials?" Amber flinched as if struck. "No, sir," she whispered. "He thinks I'm at study group after school. He's raising me since Mom left. Works 2 jobs. Frank was quiet for a moment, leaning more heavily on his cane as fatigue began to set in. The excitement had taken its toll on his 90-year-old body. People make mistakes, especially young people. The measure of a person isn't in never falling, but in how they rise afterward. Across the courtyard, Mason was engaged in intense conversation with Officer Benson, occasionally glancing toward Jason Cooper, who sat handcuffed on a concrete step, head bowed. The other teenagers were being questioned individually by the remaining officers, their stories already diverging as each tried to minimize their own involvement. Tyler Williams, the mayor's nephew, was speaking rapidly into a cell phone, his face flushed with panic. "Uncle Richard, you have to come down here." "No, I'm not joking. The police are here, and some Marines." "No, I didn't know Jason had drugs. They're saying assault on a veteran. Please, you have to fix this. Frank watched the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. Justice would be served. But there was no joy in seeing these young lives complicated by poor choices, especially knowing that some, like Tyler, would likely face fewer consequences due to family connections, while others, like Jason, might have their futures permanently altered. Shadow whined softly, shifting his weight off his damaged prosthetic. The metal joint had been bent in the fall, and though the dog was stoically enduring the discomfort, Frank could tell he was in pain. "We need to get him to a vet," Frank murmured to Mason, who had approached after concluding his conversation with Officer Benson. Mason nodded, his expression concerned as he examined Shadow's leg. "Dr. Campbell's clinic isn't far. I'll drive you both as soon as the officers have your statement." He paused, then added more quietly, "Benson says they'll need Shadow's prosthetic as evidence of the assault. They can photograph it at the vet's office." Frank's jaw tightened at the thought of Shadow without his prosthetic, even temporarily. The dog had adapted remarkably well to three-legged mobility, but he was more confident, more himself, with the prosthetic that restored his physical wholeness. "How long will they need it?" Frank asked. "A few days at most," Mason assured him. "They'll expedite the case due to the circumstances. Assaulting a veteran and a service animal won't play well in Ocean View, especially not with Veterans Day coming up next month." One of the officers approached, notebook in hand, ready to take Frank's statement. Frank recounted the events precisely, neither embellishing nor diminishing what had occurred. His military training had instilled in him the importance of accurate reporting, regardless of personal feelings. He described the blocked sidewalk, his polite request for passage, the deliberate shove that sent him and Shadow into traffic, and the theft of the Department of Defense letter. As he spoke, Frank noticed a news van pulling up at the end of the alley. A reporter and cameraman emerged, immediately capturing footage of the police cars and the teenagers being questioned. "Word travels fast in Ocean View," Mason observed, following Frank's gaze. "James Mitchell from the Gazette. Good reporter, ex-Army." Mitchell. Frank turned to look at Amber, who had paled at the sight of the reporter. "Any relation to your grandfather?" "My uncle," Amber whispered, shrinking further against the wall. "He's going to recognize me." The inevitable confrontation came moments later as James Mitchell spotted his niece among the teenagers being questioned. His professional demeanor faltered briefly, shock and disappointment flashing across his face before he composed himself and continued filming the scene. Officer Benson finished processing Jason Cooper, leading him toward a patrol car as the other teenagers watched in stunned silence. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in. This wasn't going to be resolved with a warning or a call to their parents. There would be formal charges, court appearances, potentially juvenile detention for some of them. Mason touched Frank's arm, drawing his attention. "The officer says we're clear to go. They have your contact information for follow-up. Let's get Shadow to Dr. Campbell." Frank nodded, exhaustion beginning to catch up with him. The adrenaline that had sustained him was fading, leaving behind the aches and pains of a 90-year-old body that had endured too much excitement for one day. Yet there was also satisfaction in seeing justice being served, in recovering the letter that meant so much to the families of his lost teammates. As they prepared to leave, James Mitchell approached, his camera operator hanging back respectfully, Master Chief Sullivan, the reporter asked. James Mitchell, Ocean View Gazette. Would you be willing to tell me what happened here today? Frank hesitated, never having been comfortable with publicity. Mason started to intervene, but Frank raised a hand to stop him. It's all right, Gunny. He turned to Mitchell. Today, some young people made poor choices that hurt others. Marines stepped in to make things right. That's the whole story. Mitchell smiled slightly, recognizing the deliberate simplification. I understand you're a WW2, Korea, and Vietnam veteran, and that this incident involved the theft of important military documents concerning MIAs from Vietnam. Frank's expression remained neutral. The documents have been recovered. They contain information that brings closure to families who've waited 50 years to know what happened to their loved ones. That's what matters. And the dog? Mitchell asked, his gaze dropping to Shadow's damaged prosthetic. I understand he's a military canine. At this, Frank's composure softened slightly. Shadow served 3 tours in Afghanistan, lost his leg saving his handler, and 13 other servicemen from an IED. He's earned his retirement, but as you can see, he still serves. Frank gestured to the backpack of drugs now being catalogued as evidence. His training helped identify contraband today. Mitchell nodded, clearly seeing the deeper story beneath Frank's modest account. Would you and Shadow be willing to be interviewed properly once things settle down? The community would benefit from hearing about both your service records. Before Frank could respond, a commotion near the police cruisers drew their attention. Mayor Richard Williams had arrived. His official car double-parked at the alley entrance. He strode toward Officer Benson with the confidence of an elected official accustomed to deference, already launching into what appeared to be a heated defense of his nephew. Frank watched the interaction with resignation. He'd seen this scenario play out countless times, different settings, different players, but the same dynamic of influence attempting to override accountability. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. This time, however, something unexpected happened. Officer Benson stood his ground, joined quickly by Mason Rodriguez, whose presence seemed to bolster the police officer's resolve. The mayor's gesticulations became more animated, his face flushing red with frustration as his authority failed to produce the desired effect. This isn't going to just disappear, Mason said to Frank, satisfaction evident in his voice. Benson's a good cop. He won't sweep this under the rug, not even for the mayor. As they watched, James Mitchell moved closer to capture the confrontation, his camera operator filming the increasingly agitated mayor. Public scrutiny, the great equalizer in matters of justice and accountability. Frank felt a surge of pride in his community, in these men of different generations and backgrounds, united by a common commitment to doing what was right. From young Amber facing her mistakes with newfound honesty, to Officer Benson standing firm against political pressure, to Mason Rodriguez honoring the Corps' values in civilian life. This was the America Frank had fought for across 3 wars. I think Shadow's waited long enough for medical attention, Frank said finally, turning away from the scene. And I have a letter to deliver before the day is done. Mason nodded, offering his arm for support as they made their way back to his car. Behind them, the consequences of the morning's events continued to unfold, justice taking its course in the autumn sunlight of Ocean View, Massachusetts. Dr. Sarah Campbell's veterinary clinic was a modern single-story building on the outskirts of Ocean View. its waiting room bright with natural light and decorated with photos of healthy, happy animals. When Mason pulled into the parking lot, a young woman in scrubs was already waiting outside, clearly alerted to their arrival. "That's my cousin Lisa," Mason explained as he helped Frank from the car. "Best vet tech in the county. She'll take good care of Shadow." Lisa Rodriguez approached with a wheeled stretcher designed for large dogs. "Let's not make him walk anymore on that damaged prosthetic," she said, kneeling to examine Shadow. "Hello, handsome," she murmured to the German shepherd, who responded with a gentle thump of his tail despite his obvious discomfort. With practiced efficiency, Lisa and Mason transferred Shadow onto the stretcher. The dog's stoicism faltered only when Frank stepped back, a small whine escaping as he tried to maintain visual contact with his master. "It's okay, boy," Frank assured him. "I'll be right behind you." They wheeled Shadow through a side entrance directly into an examination room where Dr. Campbell was waiting. She was a woman in her 50s with salt and pepper hair and hands that moved with confident precision as she greeted them and began examining Shadow. "Mason briefed me on what happened," she said, carefully manipulating the damaged prosthetic. "We'll need to remove this completely to check for any injury to the residual limb." She glanced at Frank. "The police photographer is on his way to document the damage before we take it off." Frank nodded, one hand resting on Shadow's head while the doctor continued her examination. The dog remained calm under her touch, trained to tolerate medical procedures, but his good eye never left Frank's face. Officer Benson arrived minutes later with a police photographer who efficiently documented Shadow's damaged prosthetic from multiple angles before Dr. Campbell carefully removed it. Frank winced at the sight of the scarred residual limb, the memory of Shadow's original injury still painful after all these years. "There's some swelling and abrasion," Dr. Campbell announced after a thorough examination. "He'll need to stay off it completely for at least 3 days. After that, we can fit him with one of our loaner prosthetics until his custom one is repaired or replaced." "Replaced?" Frank's voice tightened with concern. "That's specialized equipment. The VA helped with the original, but I don't know if they'll—" "Don't worry about that now," Mason interrupted gently. "Let's focus on getting Shadow comfortable." Dr. Campbell administered an anti-inflammatory injection and applied a cooling compress to the swollen residual limb. "I'd like to keep him overnight for observation," she told Frank, "just to be safe." Frank's face fell at the prospect of separation. Since adopting Shadow 6 years ago, they had rarely spent a night apart. The dog seemed to sense his distress, pushing his muzzle against Frank's hand with a soft whine. "Is that really necessary?" Mason asked, noting Frank's reaction. Dr. Campbell studied both man and dog thoughtfully. "Well, with proper home care instructions and a promise to return immediately if there's increased swelling or signs of pain," she began. "I'll stay with them tonight," Mason offered. "Make sure all care instructions are followed to the letter." Dr. Campbell nodded, relenting. "In that case, I'll prepare a take-home care kit and schedule a follow-up for tomorrow morning." Relief washed over Frank's face as he stroked Shadow's head. "Thank you," he said simply. While Dr. Campbell prepared medications and care instructions, Frank sat beside Shadow's examination table, the events of the morning catching up with him. His hip ached from the fall, and a bone-deep weariness had settled into his limbs. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 a.m. The veterans' meeting would begin in 15 minutes at the VFW hall across town. "I'm not going to make it to the meeting," Frank realized aloud, disappointment evident in his voice. After 50 years of waiting, the families of Martinez, Powell, and Jeffries would have to wait one day more. Mason checked his watch. "I can take the letter for you," he offered. "I know most of the veterans in town. I can explain what happened and deliver the information." Frank hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the pocket containing the precious document. These were his men, his responsibility. He had carried their memory for half a century. To entrust the final chapter of their story to someone else, even someone as honorable as Mason. Shadow shifted on the examination table, a small sound of discomfort escaping despite his training. The movement decided Frank's dilemma. Shadow needed him now, just as his teammates had needed him in Vietnam. This time, he could be present for the one who depended on him. "The letter has a cover sheet with their family's contact information," Frank said, slowly withdrawing the document from his pocket. "Their children are probably grandparents by now. They deserve to hear this from someone who understands what their fathers meant to me." Mason accepted the letter with appropriate solemnity. "I'll make sure they know everything, how you never stopped looking, how you fought to bring them home, how you carried their memory all these years." Frank nodded gratefully, emotion tightening his throat. As Mason prepared to leave, Frank found his voice again. "Your father, Mickey, he was a brave man, wouldn't leave his wounded despite being injured himself. The Corps was lucky to have him." Mason smiled, a son's pride shining in his eyes. He said the same about the Navy corpsman who pulled him out. Said that man had ice in his veins and fire in his heart. He carefully placed the letter in his inside jacket pocket. "I'll call you from the meeting, let you know how it goes." After Mason departed, Dr. Campbell returned with medications, bandages, and detailed care instructions. She helped Frank and a technician load Shadow into Mason's SUV, which he had left for them. Another Marine from the recruiting station was waiting to drive them home. As they pulled away from the veterinary clinic, Frank gazed out the window at the autumn-painted streets of Ocean View. Shadow's head rested heavily on his lap, the dog finally allowing himself to show his exhaustion now that they were alone. "Almost home, boy," Frank murmured, his weathered hand gentle on the dog's fur. The young Marine driving them, Corporal Jenkins, glanced in the rearview mirror. "If you don't mind me asking, sir, where did Shadow serve?" "Afghanistan," Frank replied. "Helmand Province, mostly. 3 tours. 15 confirmed IEDs discovered before one found him." Jenkins nodded respectfully. "My brother was in Helmand in 2010. Said the dog teams saved more lives than anyone could count. Shadow's handler said something similar before he transferred to civilian police work," Frank said, a hint of pride warming his voice. "Said Shadow had a sixth sense about hidden dangers." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they drove through town. As they passed the Veterans Memorial Park, Frank noticed a small crowd gathering around the monument. News of the morning's events had evidently spread. Several people were placing flowers at the base of the memorial. By the time they reached Frank's modest house overlooking the bay, fatigue had completely overtaken him. The emotional and physical toll of the day had drained what little energy his 90-year-old body could muster. Corporal Jenkins helped Frank and Shadow inside, setting up a comfortable bed for the dog in the living room as instructed by Dr. Campbell. "I'll check back this evening, sir," Jenkins promised. Gunny's orders. "And there's a meal being delivered from the mess, from the community center kitchen in about an hour." Frank thanked him, then slowly settled into his favorite armchair beside Shadow's makeshift bed. The German shepherd sighed deeply, finally allowing himself to fully relax now that they were home, safe in familiar surroundings. "Quite a morning, eh, boy?" Frank murmured, his own eyes growing heavy. "Not how I planned to deliver that letter, but—" He trailed off as exhaustion claimed him, his hand still resting protectively on Shadow's head. Frank awoke to the gentle chiming of his doorbell. Disoriented, he blinked at the slanting afternoon sunlight through his living room windows. Shadow lifted his head from his bed, ears perked despite his fatigue. The wall clock showed 4:30 p.m. He'd been asleep for nearly 4 hours. "Coming?" Frank called, his voice rough with sleep as he carefully pushed himself up from his armchair. His joints protested the movement after so long in one position. Shadow attempted to rise as well, but Frank gently commanded, "Stay, boy. Rest that leg." The German shepherd reluctantly settled back down, watching intently as Frank made his way slowly to the front door. Through the peephole, he was surprised to see James Mitchell from the Ocean View Gazette standing on his porch, notepad in hand but no camera operator in sight. Frank hesitated before opening the door. He'd never sought publicity for his service, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But something about Mitchell's solitary presence, without the trappings of a formal interview, suggested this might be more than a simple news story. "Mr. Mitchell," Frank greeted him, opening the door. "I wasn't expecting visitors." The reporter smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry to disturb you. Master Chief Sullivan. I wanted to check how you and Shadow were doing after this morning's incident." He paused, then added more quietly, "And to discuss my niece Amber's involvement." Frank studied the man's face, recognizing the conflict there, professional curiosity warring with personal concern. "Come in," he decided, stepping back from the doorway. Shadows resting in the living room. Mitchell entered, immediately noticing the three-legged German shepherd on his makeshift bed. His expression softened as he approached the dog, kneeling at a respectful distance. "May I?" he asked Frank, gesturing toward Shadow. At Frank's nod, Mitchell extended his hand, palm up, allowing Shadow to sniff him before gently stroking the dog's head. "My unit worked with canine teams in Iraq," he explained. "These dogs are something special." Frank settled back into his armchair, watching the interaction with approval. Shadow had excellent instincts about people, and his relaxed posture with Mitchell spoke volumes. "I saw the police report," Mitchell said, straightening up and taking a seat across from Frank. "Assault on a veteran, theft of government property, drug possession with intent to distribute. Quite a morning." "The Marines handled most of it," Frank replied modestly. Mitchell smiled. "From what I hear, you were the one who recognized what was in that backpack. Shadow, too." His expression grew more serious. "Amber told me everything. How they blocked the sidewalk, how Tyler pushed you into traffic, how they took your letter and laughed while your dog was injured." Frank remained silent, allowing the man to process his niece's actions in his own way. "She's not a bad kid," Mitchell continued, his voice tight with emotion. Her mother, my sister, left when Amber was 11. My father's been raising her. But he works 2 jobs. There's not enough supervision. Not enough. He trailed off, shaking his head. Young people make mistakes, Frank said quietly. It's what they do afterward that matters. Mitchell nodded gratefully. That's why I'm here. Actually, Amber wants to make amends. Not just a forced apology, but something meaningful. He hesitated. I also wanted to talk to you about a story I'm writing. Not just about today, but about the letter about your men who were MIA in Vietnam. Frank tensed slightly. That information was meant for their families first. I understand, Mitchell assured him quickly. Gunny Rodriguez told me he delivered the letter to the families at the VFW meeting. They've had a few hours to process it privately. But they actually approached me, Master Chief. They want their father's stories told. They want people to know these men weren't just statistics. They were real people with names and faces and families who never stopped waiting for answers. Frank's expression softened at this news. The families contacted you. Mitchell nodded, pulling out his notepad. Martinez's daughter and Powell's son were at the VFW hall. They're in their 60s now. But they were just teenagers when their fathers disappeared. They showed me photographs, told me stories. He paused, gauging Frank's reaction. They also told me about you, about how you led the search parties, how you refused to abandon the mission until directly ordered to stand down. A complex emotion crossed Frank's weathered features, part pride, part old pain. We should have found them, he said softly. They were alive for nearly 2 years after being captured. If we'd pushed further north, You did everything humanly possible, Mitchell countered gently. The families know that. They don't blame you. They're grateful to you for never forgetting their fathers, for making sure the search continued even decades later. Frank looked away, blinking rapidly. After a moment, he collected himself and asked, What kind of story are you planning to write? 2 stories, actually, Mitchell replied. One about the MIAs, their service, their sacrifice, the half-century wait for answers. The other about today, about a community's response when one of their veterans was disrespected. He leaned forward. Which brings me back to Amber. She wants to help with the second story, to publicly acknowledge her role and make amends. Frank considered this thoughtfully. How does she propose to do that? She suggested organizing a fundraiser for Shadow's new prosthetic. Mitchell explained. And for other service animals in need. The school principal has agreed to let her use it as her community service project. Tyler and the others will participate as part of their juvenile diversion program, except for Jason, who's facing more serious charges. The doorbell rang again before Frank could respond. This time it was Mason Rodriguez, still in his civilian clothes but carrying a file folder bearing the Marine Corps emblem. Master Chief. Mason greeted him, then nodded to Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Gunny, Frank replied. We were just discussing the community's response to this morning's events. Mason smiled slightly. That's partly why I'm here. Word has spread fast. He opened the file folder and removed several printouts. The Marines at the recruiting station have started a collection for Shadow's new prosthetic. We've already received offers from 3 veterans organizations to cover the entire cost. Frank blinked in surprise. That's very generous, but there's more. Mason continued. Mayor Williams called a special town council meeting this afternoon. Apparently, once he realized his nephew was caught on camera assaulting a decorated veteran and service animal, his political instincts kicked in. Mason's tone was dry. The council has unanimously voted to establish an annual Veterans and Service Animals Appreciation Day in Ocean View, with the first event to be held next month. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. Convenient timing with his re-election campaign coming up. Politics aside, Mason replied, it's a good initiative, and it comes with funding for service animal support. Frank shook his head, overwhelmed by the community's response. This is all very kind, but it seems out of proportion to what happened. I'm just one old sailor who got pushed by some kids. It's not just about what happened to you, Mitchell said gently. It's about what you represent. This community has over 200 veterans spanning conflicts from World War II to Afghanistan. What those teenagers did struck a chord with everyone who's served or loved someone who has. Mason nodded in agreement. The incident was the catalyst, but the response is about something bigger. He hesitated, then added, there's something else you should know. Master Chief, the families of your teammates. They were profoundly moved by the letter and your efforts to deliver it, despite being injured. They've asked to meet you personally. Frank's composure wavered momentarily, emotion washing across his face. After all these years, he murmured, I've carried their fathers in my memories for so long. The room fell silent as Frank processed this news. Shadow, sensing his master's emotion, lifted his head and whined softly, drawing Frank's attention back to the present. So much has happened today, Frank said finally. Frank said, Shadow injured, the letter delivered, a drug operation uncovered, and now all this community response. He looked between Mason and Mitchell. I'm not sure I understand why my small encounter has generated such reaction. Mitchell exchanged glances with Mason before responding. With respect, Master Chief, I think you underestimate what you symbolize to this town. You're not just one old sailor. You're a living link to a history many have forgotten or never knew. When those teenagers shoved you into traffic, they weren't just disrespecting one man, they were disrespecting everything you and men like you sacrificed for. Mason nodded in agreement. The Corps has a saying, once a Marine, always a Marine. The Navy has similar sentiments. What happened today reminded everyone in Ocean View that the uniform may come off, but the service, the sacrifice, the honor, those things never fade. Frank sat back in his chair, one hand absently stroking Shadow's head. For most of his 90 years, he had simply done what needed doing, enlisted when his country called, searched for his missing men when they were lost, taught history when knowledge needed passing on. He had never sought recognition for any of it. Yet now, in the autumn of his life, he found himself at the center of a community's renewed appreciation for its veterans. It was unexpected, uncomfortable even, but not entirely unwelcome. What happens next? He asked finally. That depends partly on you, Mitchell replied. The story will be told either way, but your perspective would make it complete. 3 weeks later, on a crisp November morning, Frank Sullivan stood at the edge of Ocean View's town square, watching as volunteers put the finishing touches on a newly installed platform. Shadow stood beside him, proudly sporting a gleaming new prosthetic leg with the Marine Corps emblem etched into its surface, a gift from a veterans medical technology company that had read James Mitchell's front-page story in the Ocean View Gazette. "It fits him perfectly," observed Emily Parker, the librarian who had helped Frank on that fateful morning. She had become a regular visitor, bringing books to Frank's house and occasionally accompanying him and Shadow on their shorter walks. "He's barely limping at all now." Frank nodded, pride evident in his weathered features. "The new model is lighter, more responsive. He adapted to it almost immediately." He patted Shadow's head affectionately. "Always was a quick learner." Emily smiled, linking her arm through Frank's as they watched the activity in the square. What had begun as Mayor Williams's transparent attempt at political damage control had evolved into something genuinely meaningful, largely due to the efforts of Mason Rodriguez and, surprisingly, Amber Mitchell. After her initial remorse, Amber had thrown herself into organizing today's event with remarkable dedication. She had recruited classmates, approached local businesses for donations, and personally visited every veteran in Ocean View to invite them to the ceremony. Her community service hours had been completed weeks ago, but she had continued working on the project with genuine passion. "Your speech is all prepared?" Emily asked, gesturing toward the podium being set up on the platform. Frank grimaced slightly. "As ready as it'll ever be. I'm still not comfortable with all this attention." "Too bad," came a gruff voice from behind them. "You're getting it anyway, Master Chief." They turned to find Robert Martinez, Jr., approaching, his silver hair and weathered face bearing a striking resemblance to the young lieutenant in Frank's memories. Beside him walked Timothy Powell, son of Petty Officer James Powell. Both men were in their 60s now, with grown children and grandchildren of their own. "Mr. Martinez? Mr. Powell?" Frank greeted them, emotion making his voice rougher than usual. In the 3 weeks since the families had received the official notification about their father's fates, Frank had met with them several times, sharing stories and memories that official reports could never capture. "I told you. It's Bobby," Martinez said warmly, clasping Frank's hand. "Dad would have wanted it that way." Tim Powell nodded in agreement. "And I'm just Tim. Formality doesn't seem right between us. Not after everything." Frank smiled, still finding it remarkable how quickly these men who had been just boys when their fathers disappeared had welcomed him into their lives. The meetings had been healing for all of them, filling in gaps in their understanding and providing context for the official information in the Department of Defense letter. "Is your family ready for today?" Frank asked. 3 generations of Martinez's present and accounted for, Bobby confirmed. "My granddaughter's wearing my father's service photo in a locket. Said she wanted him here too." "Same with us," Tim added. "My sister flew in from Arizona yesterday. First time the whole family's been together in years." Their conversation was interrupted by Mason Rodriguez approaching in his dress blues, ribbons and medals catching the morning sunlight. "Gentlemen," he greeted them, "we're about 30 minutes from starting. The mayor wants to review the sequence of events once more." Frank suppressed a sigh. Mayor Williams had been uncharacteristically attentive to every detail of today's Veterans and Service Animals Appreciation Day. Whether motivated by genuine remorse over his nephew's actions or by political calculation, the mayor had spared no expense and overlooked no detail. "I should check on the canine demonstration area," Frank said, grateful for an excuse to postpone another meeting with the mayor. The event included a showcase of working service dogs, including police canines, therapy dogs, and military dogs like Shadow had once been. As Frank and Shadow made their way across the square, they passed a group of teenagers setting up chairs under the supervision of their school principal. Among them was Tyler Williams, the mayor's nephew, who had been assigned the most visible community service duties as part of his juvenile diversion program. The boy's demeanor had changed dramatically since that morning 3 weeks ago. The arrogant swagger replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful bearing. Tyler looked up, noticed Frank, and after a moment's hesitation, approached. "Master Chief Sullivan," he said, his voice uncertain. "Could I speak with you for a minute?" Frank studied the boy, noting the genuine discomfort in his expression. "Go ahead, son." Tyler glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I wanted to apologize. Again. I know we did the formal thing at the hearing, but that was just words my uncle told me to say." He swallowed hard. "This is from me. I'm sorry for what I did to you and your dog. It was cruel and stupid, and I've been thinking about it every day since." Frank remained silent, allowing the boy to continue. "My grandfather was in the Gulf War." Tyler went on. "I didn't even think about that when I pushed you. He won't talk to me now. Says I dishonored the family." His voice cracked slightly. "He's right." Frank considered his response carefully. This wasn't the first apology he'd received from one of the teenagers involved in the incident, but it was perhaps the most significant. Tyler, as the instigator, had faced the harshest criticism from the community. "Dishonor isn't permanent, son," Frank said finally. "Not if you're truly sorry and work to make amends. Your grandfather knows that. Give him time." Relief flickered across Tyler's face. "Thank you, sir. I'm trying to do better." Frank nodded. "I can see that. Keep at it." As Tyler returned to his duties, James Mitchell approached with his camera. "Mind if I capture a few pre-ceremony shots?" "Master Chief, that was quite a moment between you and the Williams boy." Frank shrugged. "Just two people talking." Mitchell smiled knowingly. "Just two people talking is how healing begins. Just like your conversations with the Martinez and Powell families." He raised his camera. "May I?" Frank nodded reluctantly, still uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its purpose today. The photographer captured several images of Frank and Shadow as they continued toward the K9 demonstration area, where several handlers were preparing their dogs for the showcase. The area had been set up with various stations demonstrating the different roles service animals fulfilled, from detecting explosives and narcotics to providing mobility assistance and emotional support for veterans with PTSD. Shadow moved with renewed confidence on his new prosthetic, greeting the other dogs with dignified interest. Dr. Campbell was there, supervising the setup of the veterinary information booth. "There's my favorite patient," she called, kneeling to examine Shadow's new prosthetic. "Beautiful work. How's he adapting? Like he was born with it?" Frank replied. "Thank you for all your help with the fitting." "My pleasure," she assured him. "This event is going to help so many other service animals. We've already received donations for 3 more prosthetics for retired military K9s. Frank nodded, pleased. What had begun as a response to one incident had grown into something with lasting impact. The fundraising initiated by Amber had expanded beyond Shadow's needs to benefit other service animals across the region. As 11 o'clock approached, people began filling the chairs arranged before the platform. Veterans of all ages took their places in a designated section at the front, many in partial uniform displaying their service medals. Frank recognized faces from the VFW Hall, the American Legion Post, and his own Navy and SEAL reunions over the years. "It's time, Master Chief," Mason said, appearing at Frank's elbow. "They're ready for us on the platform." Frank took a deep breath, steadying himself. Shadow pressed against his leg, offering silent support as they made their way to the steps. Mayor Williams was already at the podium, his political smile firmly in place as he prepared to welcome the assembled crowd. The platform held a row of chairs for the distinguished guests Frank, the Martinez and Powell families, Mason representing the Marines, and the police chief representing law enforcement K-9 handlers. A special padded area had been prepared for Shadow beside Frank's seat. As Frank took his place, he scanned the audience. Emily sat in the front row, giving him an encouraging smile. Near her, he was surprised to see Jason Cooper, the teenager whose backpack had contained the drugs. The boy had been released to a juvenile diversion program that included mandatory rehabilitation, largely due to his cooperation with authorities in identifying his suppliers. He sat with an older man who bore a striking resemblance to him, his grandfather. Frank assumed. Mayor Williams tapped the microphone, bringing the murmuring crowd to attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of Ocean View, distinguished veterans, and honored guests, welcome to our first annual Veterans and Service Animals Appreciation Day." The ceremony proceeded with the expected speeches from the mayor and other officials, each carefully acknowledging the unfortunate incident that had sparked the event while emphasizing the positive community response. Frank listened patiently, one hand resting on Shadow's head, waiting for his turn at the podium. When Mason introduced him, the audience rose in a spontaneous standing ovation. Frank made his way slowly to the microphone, Shadow limping faithfully beside him. He waited for the applause to die down, unaccustomed to such recognition. "Thank you," he began simply. "I'm not one for long speeches. Never have been. Actions always spoke louder in the Navy." This drew appreciative chuckles from the veterans in the audience. "3 weeks ago, something happened on Maple Street that could have ended very differently," Frank continued. "An old sailor and his 3-legged dog were pushed into traffic. A letter containing important information about fallen servicemen was taken. In the moment, it seemed like a simple case of disrespect and thoughtlessness." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience. But what followed was anything but simple. Marines responded, police officers stepped up, a community rallied, and young people who made poor choices were given the opportunity to make amends. Frank gestured toward the section where Amber, Tyler, and the other teenagers involved sat with their families. These young people have shown remarkable courage in facing their mistakes and working to make things right. That's a kind of bravery we don't talk about enough. He turned slightly to indicate Shadow standing attentively beside him. "My friend Shadow here served 3 tours in Afghanistan, saving countless lives before losing his leg to an IED. When he came home, he needed a new purpose. So did I. We found it in each other." Frank's voice grew softer. "Service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It just takes different forms." Frank straightened his shoulders, his voice strengthening. "Today isn't really about what happened to Shadow and me. It's about remembering the men and women who served, those who never came home, and those who returned forever changed. It's about recognizing the animals who serve alongside us, often at great personal cost. And it's about teaching our young people that respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of a community worth living in. He gestured toward the Martinez and Powell families. After 50 years, these families finally have answers about their loved ones who were missing in action in Vietnam. Lieutenant Michael Martinez and Petty Officer James Powell served with honor, were captured while fulfilling their duty, and never lost faith that their country would remember them. Today, we honor their memory and the sacrifice of all those who never returned. Frank looked out over the crowd one last time. Thank you for this recognition, but please direct your admiration where it truly belongs to all who served, two-legged and four-legged alike, and to a community that remembers what really matters. As Frank stepped back from the podium, the audience rose once more, applause thundering across the town square, shadow pressed against his leg, a silent partner in both war and peace, as they faced the recognition they had never sought but now gratefully accepted. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new plaque for the Veterans Memorial, dedicated to service animals who had supported American troops in conflicts around the world. Shadow's name was among those engraved on the bronze surface, along with the simple inscription, "They served with courage, loyalty, and love." As the formal proceedings ended and people began mingling in the square, Frank found himself surrounded by well-wishers, veterans sharing stories, children asking to pet Shadow, community members expressing their appreciation. Among them was Amber Mitchell, her expression solemn but determined. "Master Chief Sullivan," she said, her voice steady despite her evident nervousness. "We've completed the fundraising for 5 more service animal prosthetics. I wanted you to be the first to know." Frank smiled, recognizing the significance of her accomplishment. "Well done, young lady. Very well done indeed." As autumn sunshine bathed the Ocean View town square, Frank Sullivan stood tall among his community, Shadow at his side, surrounded by the living embodiment of respect restored and lessons learned. Not a bad outcome, he reflected, for an old sailor and his 3-legged dog who had simply wanted to cross a street. When Frank Sullivan and his 3-legged service dog Shadow were shoved into traffic by disrespectful teenagers, it wasn't just an elderly veteran who was pushed aside, it was everything our generation has stood for. We who came of age during Vietnam, who watched friends and family serve and sometimes never return, understand what Frank felt that day. The letter he carried contained closure for families who waited 50 years for answers about their missing loved ones, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. But what happened next speaks to the America we still believe in Marines rallying